Great sun rising, family. Great sun rising. Today, we're going to look at, I hope you all can hear me okay. So I am on the microphone today. We are looking at the root. Let's find out the root of carnage and destruction. Okay? That's what I want to look into today with you. Because I have a lot of big questions to the deeper, well, to the issues that are at hand, but to look at them, look deeper within those issues so that the whole big picture can be seen to what we don't see, what we are not able to see, but is what the end result is pressed upon us or pushed in front of us. Okay. So let's take a look at the word carnage, because we've had enough, we've seen enough carnage around us. The killing of a large number of people. The bombing was timed to cause as much carnage as possible. So this is when you're dealing with carnage, you're dealing with an intentional act, right? This was on someone's agenda to create some sort of carnage. Okay? I'm looking, a large vast of resources are is under control on this planet, right? A large vast of our resources are under some sort of control on the planet. Okay. I'm gonna look at this. I'm gonna share this. We know carnage, what carnage means now, and we know it's the killing of a large number of people, and we know that it's intentional. Okay, it's an intentional act. Okay, now let's take a look at this. Let me share this screen, and this is still Carnegie, the great name Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie, okay? I'm not going to get into him right now. But let's get into this thing on impact of materials on society. We're looking at still, okay? And it says Carnegie and the creative destruction. Sean Adams. Watch the costs and the profits will take care of themselves. This is a quote from Andrew Carnegie. Okay. Now, let me tell you about last names. No one's born on earth. God doesn't give you your last name. Man, if that's a man activity. Okay, from the masculine at that. And from what I know about the history of last names is it was you were named by what you lived by and what you did. Okay. So let's look at the abstract of this subject here. This chapter uses the rise of Carney still as a case study to explore the social and economic context of materials innovation. In the United States, during the 19th century, steel became a vital element of industrial growth, and Andrew Carney revolutionized its production through a system of hard driving at his steel mills outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is an example of economic theory of creative destruction. Now, what do they mean by creative destruction? Hopefully, as we read on, we'll learn more. Okay. In which innovation and technology and organizations of the shop floor replaces long-standing institutions and practices in the production of materials as a result. They are both gains to society. In the case, cheap steel for construction of things like building and railroads, as well as drawbacks for workers and companies that try to compete with Cartney. In summary, innovation in the manufacture or materials can be a double edged sword. The President's and the Weaver's Son. Franklin Pierce should have been celebrating his inauguration as President of the United States in early 1853. Instead, he was mourning. The New Hampshire Democrat had just won 86% of the electoral vote in presidential election. Even though he was a long shot to even win the nomination, Franklin, his wife, Jane, and their beloved son, Benny, boarded a train on January the 6th, 1853, in Hanover, Massachusetts. Less than 1 mile into the journey, a coupling snapped and passenger car rolled down an embankment. Jane and Franklin suffered only slight injuries, but Benny was not so lucky. The Pierces watched horrified as the wreckage from the crash decapitated their only living son. Both parents would never be the same again. Jane brooded over the accident and even wrote a letter of apology to her deceased Benny, while Franklin never displayed the political vigor needed to unite a county rapidly coming undone over the issue of slavery. Although they felt their tragedy intensely. Unknown caller. Hold on, family. Hold on, let me get this call. Okay, I'm back. I am back. Let me make sure I'm unmuted. Okay. Ooh. Okay. Although they felt their tragedy intensely, as every grieving parent would, the Pierce experience was not a rare occurrence. In only 2 years, 1850 to 1852, over 900 Americans died in railroad accidents in New York State alone. Deficient parts, such as the coupling that failed the Pierce family in January of 1853 and worn out iron rails, signaled a technological challenge for the American railroads, as well as a safety concern that would impact ticket sales. At the same time that the Pierce mourned Benny Young, Andrew Carney had his own problems. His father, Will Carney, had been killed, had been a skilled weaver in Scotland. But when a steam powered loom opened in his hometown of Dunfermline, the elder Carney struggled to find steady work. Andre, he confided to his wife in 1847, I can get nay Namor work. The next year, the Carneys were on their way to America, where Will still could not find a job. In 1855, while gloomy President Franklin Pierce presided over Washington, Will Carney died, leaving Andrew to tend to his mother, his younger brother, and fend for himself. On the surface, the lives of Franklin Pierce and Andrew Carney appear very different. What could unite the 14th president of the United States and the immigrant son of an underemployed weaver? As it turns out, we can use Still to forge a link between these two stories. In fact, Still tells a great deal of the story of industrial America. Think of it this way. Had Andrew Carnegie still been around in 1853, the history of Pierce family might be quite different. But even as cheap and durable steel made railroad travel safer, during Carney's time, the societal cost, particularly to workers and to Carney's competitors, took an altogether different toll on us, on the US. How this connection between steel and the 19th century Americas took hold is the focus of this chapter. By understanding the context in which steel emerged as an essential material for industrialization, we can appreciate the ways in which new materials enrich our own generation. Steel presents a case study that provides a kind of blueprint for anticipating how the integration of new materials into society can generate both positive and negative results. Okay, hence the computer I am currently using now. When we look at it in the early 1900s, we didn't have such thing because they didn't have uh, the resources, but over the time, we have accumulated ways, or we have through Cartney's way of befriending and his strategies that he utilizes. We're going to get into that later, but I wouldn't say it looks good on the outside, but when you really think about it, it's not good. Okay. When you really look at how they go about to gain uh, these resources and these new innovations, you'll see the carnage. Okay. This case clearly illustrates the impact of materials on society. See, iron and steel. Iron is the second most common element on Earth, and humans have worked it into tools, weapons, and other goods for millennia. The process to convert iron ore into metal of various levels of toughness and flexibility is simple and straightforward. Cook the impurities, mostly oxygen, away from the ore, leaving the base metal behind. Still requires a bit more work to make, as it needs a particular amount of carbon, usually between 1 and 2% by weight. And this kind of precious precision requires more care than basic iron smelting. Okay. The relationship between humans and iron remained relatively stable over thousands of years until the 19th century, when innovations in production techniques and changes in consumption patterns accelerated the knowledge and pattern of iron metallurgy quite suddenly. In fact, these changes occurred so rapidly, we refer to the period as the Industrial Revolution. And iron and steel played an absolutely central role in the phenomenon, particularly in the US America, became connected to the steel in so many ways that by the advent of the 20th century, they didn't think twice about its presence in their lives. Mm-mm. Why steel? In order to understand why steel is so important, we first have to dive into the history of iron. After all, steel is simply an alloy of iron and carbon. But since the common definition of steel is that it contains up to 2% carbon by weight, its history is closely related to iron. The main property that makes iron such a desirable product is its toughness. An iron plow tears through the soil much more effectively than a wood one, but at a very high purity levels. Iron can be too weak and ductile. Adding a carbon to iron adds strength, but material but maintains, excuse me, y'all. Y'all have to excuse me. I fast and I watch what I eat. I'm very conscious. So in doing that, my body's trying to adjust to all the changes that I'm undergoing. The product flexibility, adding too much carbon makes it brittle. Okay, still with a well-controlled carbon content is the most desirable form of an iron carbon alloy. Steel can maintain a sharp edge quite well, which is why it has been a popular material for making swords for centuries. However, making steel was difficult, labor intensive process for most of the human history. Iron, on the other hand, was relatively easy to manufacture. Iron smelting is the manufacturing process that mixes iron or a carbon based fuel like charcoal or coal and stabilizing agents such as limestone. Small furnaces were found in ancient China, Mesopotamia, and Rome, which proved that iron smelting has been used for thousands of years. Pure iron reaches a liquid state at temperatures of 1,500 degrees Celsius, which is beyond the capabilities of ancient furnaces. These early furnaces produced a product called a bloom, which is a mixture of pure iron and non-metallic oxides. The bloom then had to be heated and hammered in order to remove the oxides. This labor intensive process then had to be heated and hammered in order to remove, well, I already put that intensive process meant that iron was a useful material for weapons, small tools, and decorative items, but large scale manufacturing was not possible. By the 1700s, Europeans were constructing large tower like blast furnaces that could run for months on end. These large scale furnaces could reach temperatures sufficient to create cast iron, also known as pig iron, which has a lower melting point than pure iron. The higher temperature of the blast furnaces was achieved by forcing air up through the mixture of iron ore and coke. Coke is coal that was previously heated to reduce the sulfur content. The iron subsequently liquefied at the bottom of the furnace, while the impurities in the ore bonded with the limestone or other reactants to form slag, a glassy like mixture. Once the iron maker decided the batch was ready, workers tapped the furnace, allowed the molten cast iron to drain off the bottom, and skimmed the impurities or slag off the top. The molten iron flowed into troughs dug into the sand surrounding the furnace. Workers eventually called the cooled iron pigs because they looked as if they were baby pigs suckling the large saw. The pig iron could then be reworked into iron tools, sash weights, cannonballs, plows, stoves, other products by pouring or casting the melted iron pigs into molds. Thus, the term cast iron, as stated, this form of iron had lost of had a lot lots of well it had a lots of carbon, 2.3%. Once the iron was smelted, blacksmiths could also use finery forges to remove most of the carbon using gas oxidation of the melt, thereby creating wrought iron. Wrought iron could then be worked into steel by adding small amounts of carbon back into the iron, a process called carburization. So blast furnaces made larger cast iron products more affordable, but cheap still continued to elude furnace masters. So what I'm gathering from what I just read is that it takes working. They mentioned coal, so it takes working in the coal mines, which we don't no longer have today. And I remember the controversy about how some family members did not want the coal mines to really reopen up, and some people they really needed them for the American labor to get back up and running again because it was um, a big part of our industrial revolution was having our coal mines and having steel mills and all of these things are utilizing our own resources. But when we take a look at, Carnegie is one of those big names up there with the Rothschilds and all of them. So you know where I'm headed for on that so far. Okay. And iron in the American context. Early American iron makers built their furnaces in uh, remote locations known commonly as iron plantations because they required close proximity to essential resources such as moving stream for water power. See, our streams, springs, we have a lot of resources of our own here in America. But speaking of the streams, they used to be so pure, right? But now we've increased and we brought over other materials. We allowed, a lot of Asian factories, and they really didn't give a care about our um, our environment, and it caused a lot of pollution in our waterways and different things like this. So when we really look at it, okay, and it says down here by the early 1700s, the British iron makers were forced to use coal in place of charcoal because of reduced stocks of wood. Now, I'm curious to how did they get their a hold of coal? Because I know that England is a small island. It's an island. So I don't know if they have coal mines over there, but we're gonna look and see. So yes, they do have coal mines in Britain. Let me show you. I looked up the pictures. Hey DOD, how you doing? Let's share this real quick. These are some of the pictures of the coal mines they have in England. So they do on that island over there. But I don't know much about it and how successful. Hold on. As far as how successful they are. That's a lot of noise out there. Kind of shook the house. But yeah, I'm doing well. Let's get back to this still. But I want to get into his he 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 was well known for um knowing how to befriend people and strategize and stuff like that. So we want to get into that in a minute. Let me go back and see if I can find. So we know that Carney he was important to Americans still. Okay. I'm gonna look up his book so we can look into his book. We'll first look at him. Okay. It says, "Welcome to an interactive storytelling platform about the life of Art Andrew Carney. We invite you to explore it." Okay. Andrew Carney, 1835 to 1919, was among the wealthiest and most famous industrialists of his day. Through Carney Corporation of New York, the Innovation Philanthropic Foundation he established in 1911, his fortune has since supported everything from the discovery of insulin and the dismantling of nuclear weapons to creation of Pell Grants and Sesame Street. The work of corporation and its grantees has helped shape public discourse and policy for more than 100 years. Millions of people have benefited from Carney's foresighted generosity, a legacy of real and permanent good. We invite you to learn about more about this remarkable man's life through an interactive timeline, historical documents, photographs, audio, and more. Okay.
I quote from the book published 25 years ago. This then is toil to be the duty of the man of wealth. First, to set an example of modest, unostentatious living, shunning display, to provide moderately for the legitimate wants of those dependent upon him, and after doing so, to consider all surplus revenues which come to him simply as just funds, which he is strictly bound, as a matter of duty, to administer in a manner which in his judgment is best calculated to produce the most beneficial results for the community. The man of wealth, thus becoming the mere trustee and agent for his poorer brethren, bringing to their service his superior wisdom, experience, and ability to administer. Those who would administer wisely must indeed be wise. For one of the serious obstacles to the improvement of our race is indiscriminate charity. It were better for mankind that the millions of the rich were thrown into the sea than so spent as to encourage the slothful, the drunken, the unworthy. In bestowing charity, the main consideration should be to help those who help themselves, to provide part of the means by which those who desire to improve may do so, to give to those who desire to rise the aid by which they may rise, to assist, but rarely or never to give over to all. He is the only true reformer who is careful and as anxious not to aid the unworthy as he is to aid the worthy. even more so, for in arms dealing, more injury may be done by promoting vice than by relieving virtue. Thus is the problem of the rich and poor to be solved. The laws of accumulation will be left free. The laws of distribution free. Individualism will continue, but the millionaire will be but a trustee for the poor, being trusted for a season with a part of the increased wealth of the community, but administering it for the community far better than it could or would have done of itself. The best minds will thus have reached a stage in the development of the race in which it is clearly seen that there is no mode of disposing of surplus wealth creditable to thoughtful and earnest men into whose hands it flows, save by using it year by year for the general good. This day already dawned. Men may die without incurring the secret of their fellows, still sharers in great business enterprises from which their capital cannot be or has not been withdrawn, which is left entirely a debt for public uses. Yet the day is not far distant when the man who dies, leaving behind him millions of available wealth, which was free for him to administer during life, will pass away unwept, unhonored, and unsung. No matter to what use he leaves the dross which he cannot take with him. Of such as he, the public verdict will then be, the man who dies thus rich dies disgraced. Such, in my opinion, is the true gospel concerning wealth, obedience to which is destined someday to solve the problem of the rich and the poor, to hasten the coming brotherhood of man, and at last to make our earth a heaven.
All right. That was a little bit of, you know, of a live hearing of his voice actually reading the Gospel of Wealth. That was actually Andrew Carney reading that. Okay, the wealthiest man in the world. Andrew Carney sold his steel company to J.P. Morgan for 480 million in 1901. Retiring from business, Carney set about in earnest to distribute his fortune. In addition to funding libraries, he paid for thousands of church organs in the United States and around the world. Carney's wealth helped to establish numerous colleges, schools, nonprofit organizations, and associate, associations in his adopted country and many others. His most significant contribution, both in money and enduring influence, was establishment of several trusts or institutions bearing his name, including Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh, the Carnegie Trust of the University of Scotland, Carnegie Institution for Science, Carnegie Foundation, supporting the Peace Palace, Carnegie Dunfermline Trust, Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the Carnegie UK Trust. Okay. Andrew Carney's peak wealth in a comparison to modern day billionaires. You can see the diagram here. Hmm. Okay, whatever agencies of good may rise or fall in the future, it seems certain that the free library is destined to stand and become a never ceasing foundation of good to all the inhabitants. By the time of his death, Andrew Carnegie, despite his best efforts, had not been able to give away his entire fortune. He had distributed 350 million, but had 30 million left, which went to the corporation's endowment. Towards the end of his life, Carnegie, a pacifist, had a single goal: achieving world peace. He believed in the power of international laws and trusted that the future conflicts could be averted through mediation. He supported the founding of the Peace Palace in Hague, Hague in 1903, gave 10 million to found the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in 1910 to hasten the abolition of international war, and worked ceaselessly for the cause until the outbreak of World War I. He died, still brokenhearted about the failure of his efforts. In August 1919, 2 months after signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, here's another one.
The Andrew Carnegie I will speak of this afternoon is not the one we are familiar with. Not the genius of iron and steel, not the founder of scientific philanthropy, not the builder of libraries and institutions, not the brilliant writer and social philosopher of capitalism, but instead a silly little man held in contempt by his real politique contemporaries. The Andrew Carnegie I want to introduce you to was very much a man of the 19th century, caught in the 20th century. A man of the 19th century, the century of light, an enthusiast, a utopian, a fool, a crank, who I want to honor for his vision, for his dreams, much more than for his accomplishments. Carnegie was a child of the Scottish Enlightenment, of Francis Hutchinson, David Hume, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson. From childhood on, I want to find a place for my watch so I don't. Okay. From childhood onward, he was an advocate of religious tolerance, a student of history, a believer in science and reason as guarantors of progress, a critic of dogma of any sort, a skeptic who accepted as given and true only what could be proven to him. While the foundation of his worldview was the thinking of the 18th century Scottish Enlightenment, he brought it down to earth and up to date by adding a large and compatible dose of Yankee can-do optimism, and then refitting and confirming his faith in progress by grafting it worshipfully onto Herbert Spencer's vision and version of social Darwinism. Herbert Spencer taught him that the laws of evolutionary progress guide change over time, that history has both purpose and direction, that the world was getting more prosperous, more civilized, more humane. The age of barbarism had been marked by savagery, the inability of men to settle disputes other than through violence, organized killing of innocent men by innocent men. But Carnegie was present at the dawn of a new century, the 20th century, which would be the age of civilization, which would be marked by the replacement of violence with reason in the settling of domestic, personal, and international disputes. Quote, "You will find the world much better than your forefathers did," Carnegie declared to the students of St. Andrews 5 years into the new century. There is profound, I wish I could do this with a Scottish accent, you'll have to forgive me. There is profound satisfaction in this, that all grows better. But there is still one evil in our day, so far exceeding any other in extent and effect that I venture to bring it to your notice. There still remains the foulest blot that has ever disgraced the earth: the killing of civilized men like wild beasts as a permissible mode of settling disputes. It was the task of great white men like himself, great white men who had triumphed in the social Darwinian struggle for survival and dominance and proved themselves the fittest to bring this new age of civilization into being. Carnegie had spent a lifetime preparing himself to be what the newspapers called, and which made him smile endlessly, an apostle of peace. Through his writings and his speeches, but more importantly, this was not a dumb man, through his campaign contributions and subsidies to the two parties that became the leading ascendant parties in the United States, the Republican Party, and in Great Britain, the Liberal Party. He had put himself into a position where he could make history. Carnegie did not believe in history from the bottom up. He didn't believe that the masses made history. He believed that great white men, like himself, made history. And he knew enough of them, that he was going to bring about change. He was, in this sense, a realist. He was a believer, not in speeches alone, but in institutions. And he was going to bring into being the institutions that would guarantee an age of peace. The scaffolding for this new world had already been erected. A permanent court of arbitration had been established at the International Conference at The Hague in 1899. The problem with the court, which Carnegie intended to rectify, this was a man with no small dreams, was that all the nations, and there were 29 of them, that had signed on as members of the International Court of Arbitration, every one of them had agreed to do so only if they were allowed to submit disputes that they agreed to submit. In other words, the court was a voluntary institution. If two nations agreed to go to the court to settle their arbitration, then the court was in effect. If one of those nations said, no, we don't want to submit this to arbitration, that was the end. All over. The path forward, Carnegie believed, was to make obligatory what had been voluntary. The giant step towards that new world order was, Carnegie believed, the ascendance, the political ascendance of Theodore Roosevelt. What a mistake Carnegie made, as we shall soon see. In December of 1902, President Roosevelt had persuaded Britain, Germany, and Venezuela to submit their dispute over Venezuela's refusal to pay its debts to the International Court of Arbitration at The Hague. Germany and Britain were all ready. They had their gunships outside the Venezuelan harbor. They were ready to go to war. They backed off, and they submitted the dispute for arbitration. Carnegie gushed that Roosevelt, who may or may not have persuaded Germany and England to submit their dispute, but he claimed he had. Roosevelt was a great self-promoter and publicist. And Carnegie accepted everything that Roosevelt said he had done. Quote, Theodore Roosevelt bounded into the short-lived list of those who will forever be hailed as supreme benefactors of man. The complete banishment of war draws near, Carnegie wrote. Its death wound dates from the day that President Roosevelt led opposing powers to the Court of Peace and thus proclaimed it the appointed substitute for that which had hitherto stained the earth, the killing of men by each other. Anticipating the future he and Roosevelt were going to bring into being, Carnegie committed $1.5 million, about $40 million in today's currency, to erect a courthouse and library, a temple of peace at The Hague. 18 months later, he was elated when President Roosevelt, through Secretary of State Haig, issued a call for a second Hague conference to take the work that had been done in 1899 and bring it forward. Carnegie was nearly blinded by his hope that peace was in the offing. Roosevelt, of course, played along because he needed Carnegie at that point more than Carnegie needed him. Roosevelt was being attacked from the right, from the business community, as a wild-eyed socialist anarchist. And whenever he had the opportunity, he would call Carnegie to the White House, they'd have a little chat, then Carnegie would go out, stand before as the world's, America's foremost capitalist, and say, Theodore Roosevelt is great. You know, he's a man for business, I endorse him. Roosevelt needed that. So he played along, he made believe that he was going to be this partner for peace. But he was not. And he had nothing but contempt for the little Scotsman. I've tried to like Carnegie, he wrote in November 1905, but it's pretty difficult. There is no type of man for whom I feel a more contemptuous abhorrence than for the one who makes a god of mere money-making and at the same time is always yelling out that kind of utterly stupid condemnation of war, which is in almost every case the result of a combination of defective physical courage, of humanly shrinking from pain and effort, and of hopelessly twisted ideas. It is noxious folly to denounce war per se, as it is to denounce business per se. Carnegie didn't read that letter. He didn't know what Roosevelt was saying, but the historian does. Though he had issued the call for a second conference at The Hague, Roosevelt tried to tamp down, in the nicest of ways, Carnegie's expectations. He told him this conference wasn't going to accomplish very much. But Carnegie wouldn't listen. Now in his 70s, with his philanthropic institutions established, his libraries built, The little Scotsman was everywhere at once, in print and in person, in letters, speeches, manifestos, interviews, pushing, needling, cajoling, using wit and sarcasm and money, money, money to make clear to others what was so clear to him, that war had to be outlawed, that in the 20th century it made no sense for two nations to settle their disputes by employing violence, by sending generations of young men to their doom. In the age of civilization, arbitration, reason, the International Court at The Hague had to substitute for the brutality of war. The second conference was scheduled for June 1907. In March, Carnegie funded, convened, hosted, and spoke at an international conference arbitration. It was held, guess where? Not here, it was held at Carnegie Hall. It's Andrew Carnegie, but we New Yorkers have our own pronunciation for things. Carnegie Hall, then in early June, Carnegie, to push forward, he already knew the leaders of England. He knew the leaders of France. He knew the leaders of the United States. He was the major contributor to the leading parties. But he didn't know the Germans. So he got himself invited to Kaiser Wilhelm II's annual regatta at Kiel in northern Germany. The Kaiser was a great yachtsman. He enjoyed nothing more than his annual regattas. So Carnegie took off, and he figured he would get a chance to convince the Kaiser to be the Roosevelt's partner in making peace. He didn't get much of a chance to say anything because the Kaiser was much more interested in his yachts than in talking peace to a strange little but loquacious Scotsman. Carnegie again didn't mind. He had time, he had money, he had friends on his side. He went to The Hague, where he, as a guest and cheerleader, cheered on the representatives from more than 30 nations as they wrangled at the Second Conference of The Hague, week after week, month after month, accomplishing nothing. More nations participated in 1907 than in 1899, and the conference was adjourned with a resolution to meet again, though no date was set immediately. When a date was set for the third conference, it was set in 1915. Too late. Despite the failures of the Hague Conference, Carnegie remained confident that with President Roosevelt at his side, naval disarmament, compulsory arbitration, a League of Peace would come to pass. He was delighted when President Roosevelt invited him to the White House in the fall of 1907 and heard him out. Quote, "I hit the bullseye with the president," he wrote his friend John Morley, a member of the Liberal Party establishment in Great Britain. "I know he," this is Carnegie talking, "I know he, the president, and the cabinet saw I had the true solution. Why shouldn't the angel of light choose a dreamer now and then just for a change, for a working miracle?" Carnegie's dream was now fastened on his partner, his agent. And who better to, just as, Warren Buffett was rich enough to hire Gates to spend his money for him. So Andrew Carnegie had enough influence and enough sense to pick out the man he thought was the greatest diplomat the world had ever seen to work for him. While President Roosevelt was forbidden by custom for traveling outside of this nation. Presidents didn't leave this country until Wilson would later. Roosevelt's term of office was going to end in March of 1909, which would make him available to be a full-time representative, agent, liaison, messenger for Andrew Carnegie, or so Carnegie thought. Roosevelt's first idea, however, on leaving office was not to become Carnegie's partner in peace, but to go slaughter animals in Africa. And in the end, he accomplished everything he set out and more. He killed 500 African animals, 55 species of large animals, 11 elephants, some of whom we can see stuffed at the Museum of Natural History. Carnegie knew that Roosevelt's dream was to go kill animals, but it cost a lot of money to take an African safari now, and then. And Roosevelt didn't do things in a small way. If you're going to kill 500 animals, you need a lot of bearers to carry them out, and you need a lot of people to put ammunition in your gun for you and feed you while you're off killing those animals. And Roosevelt didn't have the money to do so. So Carnegie very wisely made a deal. Roosevelt accepted. I, Andrew Carnegie, will pay for your African adventure, but when you're finished, you do my bidding. And Roosevelt said, okay. After Africa, then the real big game, Carnegie wrote Roosevelt. Meet the men who rule European nations. Then you have a source of power otherwise unobtainable. You, Theodore Roosevelt, promised to become the man of destiny. Carnegie hardly took a breath now. Every moment, every ounce of energy he had was dedicated to peace, to establishing new institutions, to bringing about naval disarmament. Bigger and bigger armies and navies did not ensure peace, but rather provoked war. Quote from Andrew Carnegie, men with pistols in their hands are more likely to shoot one another. Nations with armies and navies more likely to engage in war. And he saw in the distant future the possibility that a spark would be set off, maybe by a group of drunken Marines, German and English, getting into a brawl and someone being killed and the nations of either side being inflamed and a world war starting slowly, but inevitably. In April of 1910, Roosevelt arrived back in Europe from his African adventures and was greeted like a conquering hero. He was going to pick up the Nobel Prize he had won for brokering a peace settlement between Japan and Russia in 1905. He visited and made speeches in Paris, in Belgium, in Rome, all across the continent. And then, following Carnegie's instructions, he went to visit with Kaiser Wilhelm II. Carnegie's plan was a simple one. How do you build institutions for peace? You get nations 2 by 2 to sign bilateral treaties of arbitration in which they say on paper, and they pledge to submit their disputes to The Hague rather than going to war. And he was going to lead off by having the Germans and the English, the Germans and the British, sign the first treaty. The Kaiser was the nephew of the King of Great Britain, King Edward VII, and the Kaiser was the cousin of Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia. How difficult was this going to be? All he needed was Roosevelt to set things in motion. So Roosevelt goes to meet with the Kaiser. And the eve of his meeting, King Edward VII the Kaiser's uncle dies, the King of Great Britain. So it's clear that the plan is going to be postponed for a little bit because all diplomacy stops when a King of England dies or a queen. Everything stops. So the nation mourns, grieves, there's a coronation, funerals, and all the rest. So Carnegie thinks everything's going to be postponed a little bit. Little does he know that Roosevelt is not his agent, but his opponent. Roosevelt meets with the Kaiser and says, some silly little men want disarmament, but I know you're not interested in it. And from his meeting, he writes his friend, the historian George Trevelyan in Britain, quote, Carnegie has been asking me to try to get the emperor committed to universal arbitration and disarmament. Carnegie's purposes as regard international peace are good, although his methods are a little absurd. Does Carnegie give up when Roosevelt turns out to be his opponent? No. He finds another partner. He finds the new president, Taft. And Taft is going to be his partner. And now, instead of beginning with Germany and England, he's going to begin with the United States and England. They will sign, and Great Britain, they will sign a treaty. Then the Americans will sign with the French. Then the French will sign with the British. Then he'll bring in Germany and Italy and Russia and Japan. And two by two, the nations of the world will forego war forever and ever and ever. Such was the plan. And to push it forward, in December of 1910, Carnegie signs the final deed of gift, transferring to the trustees of what would become the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace the grand sum of $10 million, worth a few billion in today's currency. His letter to the trustees made very clear his intentions. Quote, although we no longer eat our fellow men, nor torture prisoners, nor sack cities, killing their inhabitants, we still kill each other in war like barbarians. Only wild beasts are excusable for doing that in this, the 20th century of the Christian era. He began again, starting again, his lobbying campaign. And his campaign began and ended in the United States Senate, which refused to sign an arbitration treaty, and refused in large part
Thank you, Justice.
because
Welcome.
Theodore Roosevelt was against it. And Theodore Roosevelt made it abundantly clear that the nation that pledged to arbitrate its differences would end up dishonored and impotent. The masculinist rhetoric in everything Roosevelt said is just unmistakable. Carnegie was a coward. He was not a manly man. Manly men went to war. The nation that pledged to arbitrate its differences would end up dishonored and impotent, like the man who, when his wife is assaulted by a ruffian, takes the ruffian to court instead of attacking him. So says Roosevelt. Carnegie is going to try a third time. He doesn't give up. And then the unthinkable. In the summer of 1914, as Carnegie had feared, the spark was set off. And with no institutions, no traditions, no treaties binding nations to arbitration, only treaties binding nations to go to war to support one another. There is no institutional framework to bring the nations to a peace table or to negotiate or to rethink what's going on. Carnegie does his best. He tries desperately to get Wilson to moderate, to step in. And Wilson says, no, I can't do that. As it becomes abundantly clear that this war is not going to be settled quickly, that it will be the bloodiest, deadliest, most brutal war humanity had seen. Carnegie, for the first time in his life, becomes silent. He stops talking to his friends, to his family, to his wife, to his daughter. He stops writing letters. He stops communicating to anyone. His friends are aghast, and they realize that he has suffered some sort of a breakdown, a complete breakdown. Because the 20th century, the age of civilization, was not going to come into being. In March of 1915, he was asked in an interview if he had given up, if he had lost faith in the peace impulse, in the peace process. He said no, and that was the last interview. He communicated 3 years later with President Wilson, the day before the armistice was signed. And he wrote President Wilson saying, now must be the time to establish a League of Nations. Now must be the time to establish an international court at The Hague. Wilson's response was generous. Quote, I know your heart must rejoice at the dawn of peace after these terrible years of struggle. I pray, God, it may now be possible for us to establish a League of Peace. Carnegie offered The Hague for the peace settlement, instead, the peace treaties to be signed. Instead, it was Wilson decided to go to Versailles. But he said in that last letter to Carnegie, wherever we are, you will be present in spirit. And Wilson may have been right. Andrew Carnegie remains here with us in spirit. We must not forget the silly looking little fool for peace, the man who looked like a cross between Santa Claus, and Karl Marx, standing barely 5 feet tall, gnome-like, broadly smiling, pushing for peace. He was a man of the 19th century who hoped for better in the 20th. Might we not take something away from his crusade for peace, failed though it was? From looking back across the desolate, can we not look back across the desolate, dark century that has passed? The world wars, the genocides, the killing fields? Can we not look through them and beyond to Carnegie's dreams, his hopes, his utopian belief in progress, and his work for the day when reason and humankind would take the final step forward from barbarism to civilization? The 20th century was not to be the age of civilization when war was made obsolete. Maybe the 21st or the 22nd, we can hope. Thank you.
This kind of reminds me, hold on, let me stop that. This he sounds like a George Soros. So I'm going to go over. I'm gonna come back to this video here. Well, I'll go in and show this video, but he was very, very much in contradiction, or I guess this is a silent movie. All right, the end of that. And we'll go on and to look at, how he ran his steel mills. And all this talk about, and kind of a combination of Trump in a way, you know. But definitely no consideration towards the Africans at all. Going over there, killing their animals. I really hate to see or hear, because I don't know. It just seems like he was a man concerned for the European world well-being and nothing outside of that. But when we look at this, so when in conjunction to where we're at now, he would be on the side of Trump, and the Rothschilds on the other side, right? The globalists, the one. But he wanted well-being for um, pretty much the whole European Union. The European, he wanted that European Union, and I guess they finally got that. So we're looking at here, Andrew Carney claimed to support unions, but then destroyed them in his steel empire. This is proof of his contradiction. And although everything may look good, what he did, it seemed to be for only his race, right? With his quintessential rags to riches story, Andrew Carney embodied the American dream after poverty drove his family out of Scotland in 1848. Carney arrived in the United States as a penniless 12-year-old boy. With little formal education, he worked in Pittsburgh cotton factory, earning $1.20 a week. After rising to become division superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Carney made shrewd investments in coal, iron, oil companies that made him a wealthy man by his early 30s. Well, you see, let me take a look at this and break this down. This was the 1830s. So by that time, we know the Black Wall Street was destroyed in the 19th. Wait, let me see what they say that in the early 30s of this was the 1800s, right? This had to been 18. We're looking at 1848. I got to put things into uh, time. Okay, so we're in 1848, and he arrived in the United States. But he made shrewd investments. He did all this stuff, and when I was saying this has to be okay, he was in his early 30s at that time in 1948 because he did die in 1919. So while labor and management collided over the rules of the new industrial workplace in Gilded Age America. See, by this time, of course, we know in 1914 was when World War I happened. And of course, he was disappointed in that. Assessing it was due, they say it's due to, it says who was killed that caused World War One. Okay, assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. One cause of World War One is assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary and his wife on June the 28th, 1914, by a Serbian nationalist from the Black Hand Organization. So okay, so we're going to look at what was going on in America in 1848 while he was making millions, where he was becoming wealthy. And of course, we had Frederick Douglass, okay, but y'all gonna be kind of disappointed what Frederick Douglass was doing during this time in 1840. 8 that day, that year. Okay, 1848, Douglass, along with 30 other men, attend the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. Douglass is the only African American man present and publicly supports Elizabeth Cady Stanton's stance on women's suffrage. We know that women's rights and all this stuff was created by um, it was a conversion, like a something just to distraction put forth in the way. It's something that no black man should have ever felt like he needed to get into. But we know Frederick Douglass he was raised by Caucasians, and of course, he himself is half. But still, a lot of us, we fall for these distractions. We get involved in these things instead of the important things. Okay. Several anti-enslavement organizations work together to create the Free Soil Party. So we were pretty much preoccupied with the situation at hand, these situations that were put forth. The first lawsuit challenging separate but equal laws is fought in Boston. So we were dealing with a lot of different things, slavery and a lot of other things. Frederick Douglass, of course, his thing was women's rights. Um, but the big one was the anti-enslavement organization that was much needed at that time. So it's sad to say, I was going to say that, even though, we may have had, there were some men that had the opportunity of, where am I at? That opportunity of, well, I'm going to go ahead and say it. How can you have the opportunity to do what Carnage just did? Of course, racism was rampant then, really rampant. So you wouldn't see a black man really get that chance. I come to that conclusion now after looking at that timeline. That at this time, that Carney actually, he made shrewd investments. He was what did they say, that he became a division superintendent of Pennsylvania Railroad. It wasn't until the 20th century when things opened up for the black man. But the 19th century was tough. I would say towards the late 19th century, perhaps. But the 20th century got a little bit better. While labor and management collided over the rules of new industrial workplace, Gilded Age America, Carney sold himself as the champion of the working man. He was once one of them, after all. In truth, however, Carney and his workers were hardly equal partners inside his steel mills. Once again, another contradiction. This is right here is, him being against wealth. If you was against wealth, why are you in the business of creating wealth? You know, if you're against war, you can't, it's still contradiction. See, he did all these good things, but hmm, were they really good? Were they really was his intentions good? What his was his you know, or does it sound like a manipulative control person that was controlling? Hmm. So they had, due to this, a bloody crackdown on workers at one of Carnegie's major steel mills during the infamous 1892 Homestead strike revealed how far he would go to keep unions down. Carney was pro-union in print, but it sounds like he wasn't in action. Carney opened his first steel mill in 1875, and his steel mill empire helped to build Gilded Age America as countries transformed from an agricultural society into an industrial one. In his writings, Carney expressed his approval of trade unions, the right of the working man to combine and to form trade unions is no less sacred than the right of the manufacturer to enter into associations and conferences with his fellows, and it must be sooner or later conceded. He Carney then starts to push to get rid of unions at his mills. In spite of his public pronouncements, Carney did not want unions in his steel mill. Carney claimed in his autobiography that he never employed strike breakers, yet he did so repeatedly. He followed a simple business philosophy: watch the cost and profits. He sounded like a man who just stayed in the center of things, on the line. He'd say one thing but be about another. This is a picture depicting the Homestead strike. So he changed his mind. He was no longer supportive of unions and had non-unions. So he hired a Pinkerton detective agents to allow non-union workers into a plant. However, when two barges carrying 300 Pinkerton agents docked at the same Pinkerton agents that were supposedly supposed to protect President Lincoln, however, when two barges carrying 300 Pinkerton agents docked at the homestead on July 6, 1892, gunfire erupted and pitched battle ensued, and that left at least 3 Pinkertons and 7 Union members dead. But yet, he didn't like war carnage. So, when we look at great men that made millions and billions and trillions of dollars, they're not so great to us because they're just devils. This is just a devil. And the fact, because no one else other than his skin tone was able to have those opportunities. And he didn't care one bit about those things. All he cared about was, and he didn't care about the people that were poor either under him, that came from where he used to be, that were from the same level he came from. He didn't care about that either too much. So, but somehow psychologically, people are able to, like this man, Carney, to manipulate. And, just like we see today, we see a lot of people that manipulate you into thinking that they are this great person on paper and in documents and in pictures, and then, they did this, they did that. But the underlying truth is they didn't do anything worth anything. They didn't, all they did was, all he did was keep paper rising and keep paper alive, keep fake fiat money worshipped. That's all he did. Unfortunately, that's the truth. That's the underlying truth. And carnage happening because he didn't speak out against, he wasn't really against the war as much as he said he was. you know because look, in his own steel mills there was war that broke out. Then we saw World War I break out. So a man of his influence at that time so we know what goes on today with same manipulation, making someone look good and going to these other countries and speaking to the people and gaining the people's trust on a constant basis. Manipulation happens. So manipulating these people into a trap. Now, a lot of these puppets in these African countries who the resources are not benefiting the people, the locals. The same here. We have nothing. See? Because we have puppet government as well. One that's just put in front and acting the part is not true. You know, manipulating on a constant basis. They all went to the same school of manipulation. So the true hand, we should be able to see behind it all. You know, the foundation of enslaving people of a Negroid race, sex trafficking, um, all the same things still going on from manipulation, of course. People who we think or look at as great, but it's not really, because while we've been distracted, they're over here doing this thing. And prime example of destruction that we're seeing and carnage that we're seeing today is Haiti and Afghanistan. Getting these countries, getting these people, you know, could it be a way of clearing out people from their country, from their land, you know, to distract their resources or take over like they did in Libya when they killed Gaddafi, you know? This is all one agenda. It's all connected, all the way from back then when they killed Gaddafi. Before that, everything we see on the big scale that is actually happening is all a part of their agenda. So, with that said, family, I hope you all could see the picture, the carnage, where it comes from. And we need to stop believing or dig more deep and think more critically about what we've been told, taught, shown. Because someone told me, believe half of what you see and half of what you hear and none of what you see, or something like that. It goes something like that, family. So, with that said, true love, real peace, the higher self within, the soul. Join me. I'm going to have story night on the 30th. It will be story night on the 30th. I'm just going to fine tune up this story and give it to you guys. Peace and enjoy your beautiful day. And thank you, people in the clouds, for being here. DOD, Nikki, thank you all so much. Till next time.